All right, so here we've got a modern defense. And in this position, Laurent says he was reluctant to play c5 because he thought that it might enter into a closed Sicilian that his opponent might know better than him. That said, Laurent, it is pretty obvious in this position that the two best moves for black are c5 and e5. And I would say c5 is better than e5, but maybe someone else would argue with me about that. And in general, I try to play the moves which I think are the best move, and then, you know, if my opponent knows it well, so be it. I learn something more about it. That's just an approach thing. I'm not saying you have to take it that way, but in general, you know, you want to try it. But in general, I think that's also kind of how Kasparov played, who I took a lot of my like broad level approach to chess from. You know, just like trying to play like the best moves and having a lot of confidence in yourself. And if you play the best moves and you don't win with them, that you're going to learn something from it and play them even better next time. So personally, I play moves like c5 here and transpose. You know, and even here on knight c3, I think c5 is probably the best move. But that depends on c5, d4, cd4, queen d4, which I don't know for sure, but it looks like you can play knight f6, bishop g5, bishop g7, knight d5. I guess there's a whole thing to know. So yeah, I'm not sure about c5, d4, cd4, queen d4, but I am pretty sure about this position. You should play c5. Okay, so you play like this. This is fine. Absolutely fine. I just, oh yeah, with knight c6, you're not allowing d4. And if white plays like knight e2 or knight f3 to threaten d4, you can then play e5. So it's totally fine to play this e5 approach. No problem. Yeah, to me, this move's a little bit awkward now because the main pawn breaks in the position are now f4 and f5. So to me, blocking the f pawn here is like playing knight c3 in the queenside Rui, right? In the queenside Rui, played by very few people because they think the knight doesn't stand well there, or the Jobava d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4, again because they think the knight doesn't stand well here. In this position here, I think you want to be able to use your f pawn. So I wouldn't play knight f6. It also blocks your bishop's control over d4. So I think the correct square for this knight, well, it's hard to say what it is. It might be like e6, which obviously you can't move to. I mean, I'd be very tempted to just play f5 right here and then see what kind of tensions resolve to pick where to put your knight. Yeah, I'd be tempted to just play f5 at this point. I don't know. Knight f6, you know, gaining this like h3 tempo. But then, and then you're saying you're switching to play in the center now that they've spent this tempo here. But you also spent a tempo on d6. So it's not like you're so far up in development. Right, knight h6 is another move I was thinking of, which also has the idea to make them play h3. Then your knight stands there and you play f5, and then your knight goes to f7. It's another way to play. Perfectly reasonable. Okay, so here, my thought would be like knight d5, stopping d5. That's one thought. And then my other question would be like f4, d5, and how good or bad is that? It's an important question. Looks okay for black, actually. So that at least justifies what you've done. if you have enough power to play d5 against f4, with the pressure on e5 not being enough to stop you. So there the h3 is kind of costing white a little bit. So maybe the key move is just knight d5, preventing your d5 move. And then from here, the game just goes on with maneuvers. Maybe knight to e7 is best now. Yeah. And then here, here, here. Something like this makes sense, maybe. So, okay, so bishop e6 plays queen d2. You play queen d7, and you say that d5 has been played immediately in databases, but you were concerned about bishop g5. Yeah, I mean, d5 seems like the logical move, so you did have your eye on the right move, and this is logical in terms of like, well, he played h3, now I'm going to play d5. So it's logical to be looking at it. So let's see how you're doing with fear here real quick. Like, you're concerned about bishop g5. So the threat of bishop g5 is to take and take. If you play knight e7, bishop f6, d5 is secure. You can also just trade off on e4, as you say, or play d4. Yeah, I mean, realistically, I would assume that any of those moves are fine for you, Laurent. Like, I can tell you my instinct because I haven't like looked down any of your variations yet. I think d4 should be fine for you. I think knight e7 should be fine for you, and I think de4 should be fine for you. So I can't say that bishop g5 is a justified fear. Your opponent's played h3, now he's played bishop e3, bishop g5. It seems like this is good for you, for them to be doing that. So I'm not even going to go down the variations, I think, because I don't think it's about the variations here. I think you just need to understand that the position's fine for you, and that realistically, like h3 followed by moving the bishop twice can't threaten you when you've played all straight up developing moves like this. You know, I'm not saying you have an advantage because you're black, so white can afford to lose a tempo. But I'm saying the fear is unfounded, regardless of what you calculated. To be honest, it might even be a mistake to be calculating in order to make this decision. I mean, you can calculate a little bit to get a further sense of the position, but not to make your decision. The decision is just to play d5, and you're going to be in a good position. And then if you want to spend, I would play d5, and then then if my opponent spends a while on their time, I might think about my answer to bishop g5. You know, and just sort of bounce around. Am I going to play d4 or de4 or knight e7? But you don't need to know which one you're going to play in advance when you play d5 necessarily. So I would play this move, the correct move. Odds are they're just going to trade everything off, and you'll never need to know what you were going to do about bishop g5. So play d5 and then start calculating lines there. Okay. And the variations, and let me say this, the variations after bishop g5 are going to be complicated. So you can expect to miscalculate some of them and then be misled by them. Does that make sense? Like, you have to have a sense of which decisions are made by calculation and which aren't, and you also have to have a sense of your own strength and weakness as a calculator, and like know that there's like certain positions where you're going to have, you know, how much error am I going to make when I calculate these variations in this position to this depth. And honestly, like, I would assume I was going to make a mistake if I tried to calculate very deeply about how d4 knight d5 was gonna work out, right? So there's going to be errors in your calculation. The huge error, however, is going to be if you choose to calculate to make the decision, miscalculate something, and then make your decision based on a miscalculation when you could have just told yourself, like, I've developed every single move. He lost one tempo, so now it's like, essentially in this position, it's like you're white instead of black, so it's not like a major advantage or anything, but you're white instead of black. And if I play a healthy looking pawn move in the center, can white refute it by moving a piece a second time without this knight out? And the answer is no, right? So on principle, this can't be a problem, and so you just play d5. And if you calculate some lines with d5 and it looks bad for you, you have to have the discipline to still play d5. That's why doing the extra calculations can actually be a bad thing, because psychologically, it can be harder to play d5 once you've spooked yourself with some incorrect variations. But you have to still play d5 and wait to see whether they play bishop g5 and keep looking for moves that are okay. And even if you don't see how things are going to work out for you, you'll probably stumble down into some variation that actually is okay after a while, right? Like, I don't know, you play this and this. You have to play some moves, so you get some kind of a position. Then you get here, and then suddenly you find this. I was just trying to blunder here. I wasn't even calculating. I was just making random moves, like, sort of naively. It looks like we trapped his bishop, right? I, like, won completely by accident. So, okay, if he can't take on h6, now that we get to this point, we start seeing more accurately one move ahead, so I guess he takes and we take, and we've got the better bishop and some more space in the center, and our knight's out before theirs, and we can castle either side. Okay, yay! Right? And you might not see all of that at the beginning, but you just stumble towards it like I just did. I completely lobotomized myself there to try and, like, imitate it. I wasn't calculating tons of moves ahead or showing you something, like, precise. I was talking the whole time. I didn't ever stop and focus. I'm looking at the chat, not the board too much. So I just like, make some plausible move, right? Like, can I play h6 here? Like, what could happen? They could trade. They go for this pawn. Did I lose? Nope, I can do this. Okay, at some point along the way, you maybe notice that, and then, yeah. And there's a solution, right? So there's one solution. That's d4, and then d takes e4. Again, you have, like, if they take on e4, you can obviously unpin, so you don't need to be worried about that, right? They move their bishop a third time, and whatever you play, knight d4 or something with an edge for black, it's basically equal. Or they could play knight e4, and you can take, hitting their queen, and once you notice that move, basically you get this position again. So, I mean, you can see that nothing, like, bad is going to happen to you here. Yeah. Cool. Interesting how calculating can actually, like, make you play worse when it's not the right time to calculate, right? Not just take time off your clock, but actually worsen the move that you make. Well, so now you play d5. And now still you thought bishop g5 is the best try there. Yeah, I mean, the thing about this is what you're allowing knight d5 for one more move, right? That's the downside to not having played d5. This move is, like, my instinct for what white should do at every point once you play for d5 is prevent it. And, yeah. This move is, like, a little bit annoying. Again, I think you'll play, like, knight e7 and I'll trade and you'll take with your queen. So we'll get the same thing that you could have had last move without playing queen d7. If you'd played knight d5 when I would have. So you thought bishop g5 is good for him here. I imagine it doesn't make much of a difference. By the way, my instinct is that a lot of these positions are, like, basically equal and doesn't make a huge difference which way you go. It's just, it'll be a slightly different style of position, but about equal. This position looks kind of good for black. I'm not sure why we're doing this for white. Oh, to play knight g5. Yeah. Yeah, I see I see why you might think this might be good for white, but I feel like it's fine. Or I mean, I can see like the idea behind why white might go for something like this, but it looks like it's just another version of equal, to be honest. I don't see any big difference between it and what happens in the game. Yeah, it's definitely time to castle here. And now you go for this. Now, you have some small chances at an advantage here. I don't know how you were calibrating at this point, but you have some small chances at an advantage here because of this nice pawn on a dark square. I mean, it's small, you know. I've played for this kind of advantage many times and not been able to do much with it. It's pretty small, but I feel like knight d4 lets white trade every minor piece. Doesn't that increase the drawishness, maybe? Well, I mean, we'd have to check. We'd have to be careful about it. This move, knight cb4, which you mentioned, looks interesting to me as well. Oh, it's knight cb4, not knight db4. Now I know how much lag there is, Chess Beast. Okay, how about we look at one of these knight b4 moves for a moment? You've got knight cb4, king b1, knight b6. And this is the one I was actually thinking about, to still have knight d4 in reserve. So now king b1, knight d4. Attacks here, and if you trade, there's this problem. So a3. And there's not really any follow-up on that. So that doesn't do anything. Yeah, I mean, what else could you do? I mean, you could just play like, you know, f6, rook h8 kind of moves. Just calm, not doing anything. Let's have a look at knight d4, though. Let's evaluate the move you actually played, see if it's any good. You put a3 exclam here, so let's see what's wrong with knight d4, ed4, knight d5, bishop d5, bishop d5, queen d5, king b1. All right, so this gives you one move to try and come up with something, and it's going to have to be like rook here, queen here. The thing about rook here is then white could take this pawn, so I don't know how good that is. And rook here, white could play queen g7 at some point. So maybe start by attacking the pawns. Right? See if we can tie white up a little bit with the queen. And then after rook hf1, now play rook e8. The thing is, white can then play a move like queen f4, right? And you're just back to playing queen d5 pretty much equal. But if you put the other rook here, then after queen h7, you have to justify the pawn sack, and they're playing queen f7 next, right? Black would have to have something really concrete here, which I'm not seeing or feeling. I'm thinking this is a draw. So to me, when you play this move knight d4, you're allowing this mass simplification on d5, which tends towards an immediate draw. Or, I mean, just like immediately creates a position that will kind of inevitably tend towards a draw. So if you're hoping to get more out of this position or more out of this game, if you want some more time to outplay your opponent, or if you think you've got a slight edge, then I think your move is actually f6 here. Defending the h-pawn like this, covering g5 and e5 squares, dark squares, keeping the queen from getting in there, and preparing to play rook to e8 with the queen defending h7. And just building some more. That's what I see there. if you wanted to keep things going. Okay, you didn't know that the d4 pawn could become a weakness even, and that is true. You don't have much but d4. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. I think really d4 is not like a major problem at the moment. You can certainly, I mean, you're not in any danger of losing this position here that I played for you. You can also put the queen on f3 instead of g2 to avoid queen f4. But then you don't have this extra attack here, right? And then you can just play it like this. Right? This is fine. You know, you're not worse or anything. This isn't like a major problem, but it's not an asset either, really. Without minor pieces, this becomes an example of a pawn that can sometimes be like over advanced and weak, you know? Like if queens come off the board and a rook ending, there's a plan of king here, king here, king here, which is annoying. It's also a good plan in a king and pawn ending, obviously. So there is a point after which a space advantage becomes a weakness, and in general, that is when your opponent's traded enough pieces that your space advantage isn't restraining their pieces, and especially if their pieces are able to get past your pawn structure. So as long as your opponent's rooks are in front of this pawn, it's okay. But once they get pieces in behind it, it starts to become a problem to have space. When your opponent gets behind your space becomes a disadvantage. And for those of you who have like diamondchess.com memberships, there is a video I did, or maybe it was a couple videos, it's been several years, about space advantage in which I talked about, yes, some examples where you can squeeze a space advantage even in an endgame, but also some examples where you know, your opponent can get behind your space and it can actually be a disadvantage. And that's an important factor to know, that a space advantage depends and sometimes is a disadvantage. So it sounds like you've really understood afterwards what the value of the position is. I think you gave this move f5 a question mark, huh? A convoluted move out of frustration because I couldn't make the normal moves work. Your plan is rook f8, bishop g8, rook f6. Well, it won't happen. Right, the main thing is you're losing flexibility with this move and your bishop becomes bad. I think you've understood this game pretty well, Laurent, actually. I mean, a lot of your comments here are like dead on in terms of like the positional thing. The pawn's better on f6 because your e-pawn's defended. You have more flexibility. You can always come to f5. And it doesn't block in your bishop. So, you know, his h3 pawn is something that he's actually defending at the moment until you play f5. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You wanted to play b5. Holy moly. Lead nowhere and just create weaknesses. I agree with you. It will lead nowhere and just create weaknesses. And you said white could do the wholesale exchange here, and you're not sure you have anything after the e-file opens. You're right. This move is just a blight on your position here. Well, that's perfect. During the game, you didn't understand anything, and after playing it, you did. That's like great. That's like a super learning experience. Yeah, you're right. This is... I mean, you evaluated this as a bit unclear. I'll confirm for you that this is like bad for black. I mean, not like bad, just bad, like not good. You know, if you play rook e8, I trade and take h7. If you do nothing, white plays rook e4, rook de1. And the b pawn's not really doing anything for you. Unless I just blundered queen a2. In which case, in this position, white still needs to play king b1 before fighting for the e-file. But in either case, the general positional consideration is you don't actually really have anything, and the b pawn's not helping. So yeah, so no play b5. Rook he1. Now you come back. You're spending a lot of time because you didn't know what to do, really. Yeah, that is normal. So you decided to keep the pieces on the board and retreat from all these exchanges. Some repetition, some trading. Yeah, I would keep the queen on the board here because, in my opinion, this move queen trades is correct now. Knight takes allows this, and pawn takes. You know, he's the first on this file, and this pawn is a slight liability. So, Well, I guess if the knight had to go here, it'd be okay. Maybe the knight goes to a2 and b4. I mean, I think it's holdable, but I think this is like you'd rather have your pawn back on d5 in this endgame. I don't think this is good at all. So I'm not pumped about queen d4. I would keep the queen on if I were you at this point. You know, maybe even stick it over on a5. You can still dream about b5, b4 if you do that. But most importantly, from here, your queen's covering some important central squares without being like on the file of your opponent's rooks. It's keeping your eyes on this. Maybe there's something there at some point. Maybe he eventually does this. So the other good move to tuck your queen is queen f7. Defending h7, just getting out of the way of things, you know, staying off these rooks. That's probably the best move, actually, just balanced queen f7. So knight e2. Guys, trade f4 exclam. What? f4 gives you a pawn majority on the king side. I would say f4 question mark. Yeah. f4 question mark. It gives black a kingside pawn majority. That's like a major mistake. Also, this pawn on e5 is slightly vulnerable, right? He should just be transferring this knight to like f3 or something. Right? Play here and here and here. Knight d4, there's rook e5, so you get the knight to f3 in time here. Yeah, this f4 move, this is a big mistake from him. And you can take already and get the pawn majority, but then you bring his knight to f4, which is a good square. So you could also just, you know, put your rook on e8 and let him take and bring your knight to e5 and then like f3 or something. So here, I would be inclined to play rook d e8, followed by h6, g5, and maybe rook h f8. I don't know exactly the order of whether to push the pawns or put the rook on f8 first. But that's what strikes me here is what you want to do. So I think you did the wrong rook to e8. You were right that you could just leave the tension, but I think your plan would be to like push your f pawn. So you want this rook over here, right? And then g5. d4, c3. Great, you got control of the e file. This is crucial. In Shereshevsky's endgame manual, he analyzes some games with the 3-on-2 versus the 4-on-3. And I think there's like a really good Alyehin game. And in the notes that he explains that in these positions, with the competing pawn majorities, it's actually still like the crux of the position is who controls the mutually open file. Super, super valuable. So you got that here with this move knight d4, which was really... turns out really strong, I think, because this is coming and he doesn't have a good answer to it. Yeah, he doesn't have a good answer to it. So you grab the e file here, which is very nice for you. Can he play knight d5, king c2 and get a draw? So what's the plan here? This move looks a little bit dangerous, you know. What's the calculation here? Oh, it's that on king c2 you can just go here. Yeah. Okay, so there's no knight d5. That's true. That's clear. Unless it's something really weird, like check here, king here. But you can always do this and then take this and then this and then this, which is good for you. Okay, so no knight d5, so maybe king c2 and then knight d5. I don't know. So he plays d4. Oh, you said maybe through g2 he could get a draw here. That makes sense. But can you play this move? Once you've taken the pawn over here, the second time instead of retreating, come back here. And now on knight f4, you have rook to e1. And you go to the knight endgame up a pawn. That's pretty good. So you can actually get out of that repetition. It doesn't work either. He doesn't have a draw here. Ooh, nice knight maneuver. Please be able to play g5 and f4. Looks like you didn't do it, and you said it was difficult to calculate. So let's check how difficult it is to calculate. Whoa! Why does this? Why can't you just play this move? Knight c3. Okay, I mean, you could calculate that, but what about just this? f4? Doo-doot. 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 That pawn looks darn strong. I don't even see anything to calculate. I mean, knight g5, no. h4, like, in theory, you could calculate, but you can always just play h6, and there's not really much to calculate. But if you want to calculate, you can calculate f3, hg, f2, and see that that wins for black. So that means you can play f3. They have to play rook f1 already, and then you could take this pawn as well and win even harder. Or maybe knight c3 here to win at this point. I think f4 is winning here. It sounds like you tried to calculate something extra complicated because you noticed this, but the main idea when somebody wants to like trade with your majority like this, the main thing is g5 f4 to see if you can just push past it to make a pass pawn, right? Because like what you didn't really want to do is trade like this, right, and not have a pass pawn yet. That's what you don't want to do. You can allow them to take sometimes. That can be fine. But like what you'd like to do is play g5 f4. And I think you could have. Pretty sure that just wins. And now you play fg4. All right, so here again, you can play f4, which would be like the main point of rook f3, but I guess you were looking into some calculations with it. And then you backed off after calculating a long line like this. And now you calculated even longer lines after the game. This position here could lend itself well, Laurent, to the endgame practice exercise that I taught you guys. If you remember it, you could play this position as black a couple times against a friend, see how these G and H pawns compare to white's majority on the queen side after they win your C pawn, right? This would be a good position to practice like that. It's a difficult one to analyze out super precisely by yourself. This position lends itself a little bit more to like some analysis with someone else. I would say my first thought is to play c6 to just not lose the c pawn, since you can't play f4 here. Maybe just play c6. Then white doesn't have a passed pawn yet, right? And then white can try and like attack these pawns from behind, like here or here, followed by here. But the truth of all these positions here is that even if you lost one of these, you would still have the advantage, right? 3-on-4 with an outside passer. So you can afford to, search here for your opportunities. Sure, you can play rook c7 first if you want. You're thinking check and knight c7 might mate me at some point, but I have b5. So I'm not going to get checkmated. And then this position here you can work on. You can look at rook f3, you can look at h5, rook f5, h4, you can look at knight d6, rook f6, knight c4, rook f5, check here, check here, check. You could try out this variation, right? So You can just practice this whole position out a bit with different things, but I would imagine that it's going to be pretty good for you. But honestly, I feel like you're calculating long variations again when ideally you could make a positional judgment. And the positional judgment would be that this move f4, which you don't even mention, looks really strong here. His rook is still trapped in, and you seem still pretty strong in this area. Hard for the white king to get at your pieces. You could follow with rook f2 and f3. You could follow with g5, looking at rook h3. You could follow with bringing up your king and sending his knight somewhere weird. Definitely a lot of options. You could follow up with rook to g3. Seems like a good option, right? If he trades, that pawn probably pretty close to queening. If he doesn't trade, then f3, f2, and you've got rook g1, or your rook's good on g3. So I think it's similar actually to what we noticed earlier in the very, very opening, your handling of the opening and of this endgame, that you're trying to calculate some ambitious variations, right? So far as like you're trying to calculate lines that are relatively long and lead to you making some mistakes in the calculation. In positions that to me, and I'm a calculator by nature, but to me these positions aren't particularly calling out for calculation. They're asking me to make kind of positional judgments and not calculate too much and not be too worried about all the details. So I haven't seen hundreds of your games, but from what I'm seeing here, my first thought is you try and calculate variations that are a little bit too hard for you. You get spooked by what you see / maybe some uncertainty because the variations get a little fuzzy as you're analyzing them further out, and then maybe you shy away from things from positions that could be really good for you. All right, and with that, I'm going to have to jump to another game. Should we just see what happened here quickly, folks? I guess some of you might want to know the results, so we'll just click through the moves here so everyone can see. Did this, did that, centralized the king, sent him there, trade into the rook and pawn ending. This is another position that's great to practice. I think most of your advantage is gone here because this pawn majority is not very good right now. Ooh, now he lets you get that passed pawn. That's amazing, as well as allowing rook to g4 at some point. Oh, but he gets rook e6. You can't stop this? It's a problem. Oh, so you're saying g5 was good because he actually has this trick. Yeah. And now you're defending a pawn down endgame. Still very good chances of drawing. Yep, everything's fine. This is fine defense. Fine defense and draw. Okay. Cool. Yeah, so once you play fg4, hg4, that fundamentally changes your pawn structure advantage on the king side. Let's say that, right? This pawn structure here is just it's not really conducive to winning. So if you wanted to make something of this position here, I don't know, you got to find maybe like knight d2, king b4, knight f3. You got to do something with these pawns But it just doesn't look that promising anymore because you just don't have an exciting pawn majority. He's got here if you try and mess with his knight. He's got rook h1 at any point drawing. Yeah. So once that pawn structure change happens, your advantage is kind of gone. Your advantage here is twofold at this point. Control of the only open file, so higher rook activity, and the kingside pawn majority. And if you play g5 f4 or rook f3 f4, which is not as good but similarly good overall, you maintain the superior rook and like a healthy passed pawn. As soon as you make this trade, there's now open files for his rook as well, and your pawn majority is no longer very good. So it's like, you know, the advantage kind of disappears in a poof right there.